You were never asking for too much. That is the lie that slowly destroyed you. The real problem is that you kept trying to receive consistency from someone who only knew how to give you moments. And moments are dangerous because moments feel like love when you have been starving long enough. You told yourself they were confused, busy, emotionally overwhelmed, healing. You kept finding new words to explain behavior that quietly kept breaking you in the exact same way. And maybe the hardest part is this: they were never fully gone. That is what kept you trapped. If they had disappeared completely, maybe you would have healed faster. But they did not. They always came back just enough to restart your hope before disappearing again. You know this pattern. Everyone who has ever loved an avoidant person knows this pattern. One week they pull you close like you are the safest place in the world. Their voice softens. Their walls fall. They look at you in a way that makes you believe something real is finally happening. You feel chosen, seen, important. And just when your nervous system finally starts relaxing into that connection, something shifts, their energy changes, their texts slow down, their warmth disappears, conversations become shorter, their eyes feel farther away, even when they are right in front of you. Then suddenly you are alone in a relationship that technically still exists. And this is the part nobody talks about. The silence hurts more than rejection ever could, because rejection gives closure, silence gives confusion, silence forces your mind into detective mode. You replay every conversation, every sentence, every tiny change in tone. You wonder if you became too emotional, too needy, too available, too intense. Your brain starts searching for the exact moment everything changed, because some part of you believes if you can just identify the mistake, maybe you can fix it and bring them back emotionally. That is how the loop begins, not with drama, not with screaming, but with uncertainty. Uncertainty is one of the most addictive emotional experiences a human being can go through, because the brain always chases resolution. And an avoidant person, whether consciously or unconsciously, becomes the source of both your emotional high and your emotional starvation at the exact same time. They become the person who wounds you and the person you run to for healing. That dynamic alone is powerful enough to keep someone emotionally trapped for years. And what makes this even more painful is that most empathic people do not leave when they are hurt. They stay longer, they love harder, they become more understanding, more patient, more self-aware. They convince themselves that deeper love will finally create safety. So while the avoidant pulls away to regulate themselves, the empath moves closer, trying to repair the emotional distance before it grows larger. One person withdraws to feel safe, the other pursues to feel safe, and both people unknowingly trigger the exact fear living inside the other. That is why this dynamic feels impossible to escape once it begins. Because every time they pull away, your attachment deepens. Every time they return, your hope resets. And eventually you stop asking yourself whether the relationship is healthy. You only ask whether you can survive until the next moment of connection arrives again. That is the moment people lose themselves, not because they are weak, not because they are desperate, but because intermittent love changes the nervous system. The human brain is not designed to stay emotionally balanced inside unpredictable attachment. When affection becomes inconsistent, the mind starts obsessing. What used to feel natural suddenly feels earned. You stop experiencing love as peace and start experiencing it as relief. Relief that they texted back. Relief that they called. Relief that they still care. Relief that you have not lost them today. And the terrifying part is that from the outside, nobody sees the damage clearly, because there are still good moments. There are still conversations that feel intimate. There are still nights where they suddenly become vulnerable again and make you believe the connection is finally becoming real. That is why people stay, not because the relationship is always painful, but because the pain is interrupted just enough by emotional closeness to keep the nervous system addicted to hope. You begin living emotionally on crumbs while calling it love. And slowly, without realizing it, your entire emotional world starts revolving around someone who cannot consistently hold intimacy without feeling overwhelmed by it. You become hyper aware of their moods, hyper aware of their distance, hyper aware of every subtle shift in energy. Their silence controls your peace, their attention controls your confidence, their return controls your happiness. And somewhere during all of this, you stop noticing the most dangerous thing happening. You are no longer asking whether they are emotionally available. You are only asking what you need to do to finally become enough for them to stay. That is the trap. And most people never realize they entered it until they are emotionally exhausted, staring at old messages at 2 a.m, trying to understand how someone who once made them feel deeply loved could also make them feel completely alone at the exact same time. At first, you think it is just a rough phase. That is how almost every empath enters the cycle. You tell yourself they are stressed, maybe work is overwhelming them, maybe they are emotionally exhausted, maybe they just need space. And because you love deeply, because your instinct is always to understand before you judge, you do not immediately see the pattern for what it is. You see a person struggling. So instead of protecting yourself, you become softer, more patient, more available. You start giving more love. Exactly at the moment you should probably be stepping back. Then suddenly they return. Their energy changes again, almost overnight. The same person who disappeared emotionally for days suddenly becomes warm, attentive, vulnerable. They text you paragraphs again. They call you late at night just to hear your voice. They tell you they miss you. They tell you nobody understands them the way you do. And the moment that warmth returns, your body relaxes instantly. You stop questioning everything. You stop doubting the relationship. The anxiety disappears for a little while and all you feel is relief, not happiness, relief. That is an important difference because healthy love creates stability. Trauma loops create relief after suffering. And most people never realize they are confusing the two. The dangerous part is how quickly the brain adapts to this cycle. Eventually, your entire emotional state becomes dependent on their distance. When they move closer, you feel alive again. When they pull away, your nervous system crashes. You stop waking up emotionally stable. Instead, you wake up checking your phone, checking their tone, checking the speed of their replies, checking whether their energy feels different today. Your peace slowly becomes conditional on someone who cannot consistently give you emotional safety. And because the changes are subtle, because nobody suddenly announces they are emotionally unavailable, you spend months trying to solve a problem you cannot fully see yet. You notice yourself overthinking things you never used to overthink. A shorter text suddenly ruins your mood for hours. A delayed response feels like emotional danger. A small shift in tone makes your chest tighten because your nervous system has learned that distance can arrive without warning. That is why empaths become obsessed with tiny details inside these dynamics. Not because they are irrational, but because unpredictability trains hypervigilance. Your mind starts scanning constantly for emotional clues that might help you prepare for abandonment before it happens again. And the exhausting part is that, something feels wrong, but every time you are about to leave, they reconnect just enough to pull you back emotionally. They open up again. They become affectionate again. They give you another glimpse of the version of them you fell in love with in the beginning. And because that version feels so real, you convince yourself the cold version is temporary. You start treating inconsistency like a problem you can heal instead of a pattern you should pay attention to. That is how the loop deepens. You stop looking at reality as a whole and start emotionally surviving moment to moment. One good conversation suddenly erases weeks of confusion. One vulnerable night suddenly outweighs months of emotional instability. Your standards slowly disappear because your nervous system becomes addicted to emotional reunion. And the hardest part is that empaths blame themselves almost automatically. That is what makes this dynamic so psychologically brutal. You think maybe you became too emotional, too reactive, too attached, too available. So instead of questioning why someone keeps withdrawing from intimacy, you start questioning your own worth. You begin trying to become easier to love, less emotional, less needy, less expressive. You rehearse texts before sending them. You hold back feelings you desperately want to communicate. You pretend things do not hurt you because you are terrified honesty will push them away further. Slowly, you abandon your authentic self in exchange for emotional survival. And the avoidant person often does not even realize the damage fully while this is happening, because from their perspective, they genuinely do care about you. That is what makes this dynamic so confusing. They are not always cold. They are not always manipulative. Sometimes they truly miss you. Sometimes they truly feel safe with you. Sometimes they genuinely want closeness. But the moment intimacy becomes too real, too consistent, too emotionally exposing, something inside them panics. And instead of moving closer through fear, they create distance to regain emotional control. That distance then activates your fear of abandonment, which makes you pursue harder, which then overwhelms them further, causing even more withdrawal. And suddenly both people are trapped in a cycle. Neither fully understands, but both keep reinforcing unconsciously. One person fears losing connection. The other fears losing freedom. One moves closer under stress. The other moves away under stress. And every interaction slowly becomes a trigger instead of a place of safety. This is why empaths inside these relationships become emotionally exhausted in ways they cannot explain to other people. Because the pain is invisible. There is no clear betrayal, no obvious ending, no clean break. Just months or years of emotional whiplash that slowly teaches your nervous system to associate love with anxiety, and eventually you become someone you barely recognize. You become emotionally dependent on small signs of affection. A single message can change your entire day. One cold interaction can destroy your emotional stability for hours. You start losing focus in your work, losing sleep at night, replaying conversations while driving, imagining scenarios in your head, trying to predict what version of them you are going to receive next. The warm version, the distant version, the loving version, the emotionally unavailable version. And the most painful realization is this: the relationship starts consuming more emotional energy than it actually gives back. But because the connection feels so intense during the good moments, you keep believing the next emotional high will finally make all the confusion worth it. That is how people stay trapped for years inside relationships that are slowly draining the life out of them without ever fully collapsing. The hardest part about this dynamic is that neither person usually understands what is actually happening while it is happening. From the outside, it looks simple. One person pulls away, the other chases. One becomes emotionally unavailable. The other becomes emotionally overwhelmed. But underneath that behavior is something much deeper than communication problems or bad timing. What you are really watching is two nervous systems reacting to intimacy in completely opposite ways. And most of those reactions were formed long before either of you met. An avoidant person is not distant because they do not feel anything. That is one of the biggest misunderstandings people have. In many cases, avoidant people actually feel emotions very intensely. The problem is that closeness does not only create connection for them, it also creates danger. Somewhere earlier in life, intimacy became associated with pressure, loss of freedom, emotional unpredictability, criticism, rejection, or disappointment. Maybe they grew up in a household where vulnerability was ignored. Maybe emotional needs were treated as weakness. Maybe love only appeared inconsistently. Maybe the people they depended on emotionally were unstable themselves. So their nervous system adapted the only way it knew how. It learned that emotional distance equals safety, independence equals control, self-reliance equals survival. That adaptation might have protected them as children, but in adult relationships, it creates a devastating contradiction because they still crave love. They still crave connection. They still want intimacy. But the moment intimacy becomes real enough to require emotional exposure, their nervous system interprets that closeness as a threat to stability. That is why avoidant people often look completely genuine in the beginning. Because in the beginning, intimacy still feels safe. Everything is light, controlled, idealized. There is distance built into the connection naturally, But as emotional attachment deepens, the nervous system starts detecting risk. Suddenly, the relationship no longer feels exciting. It feels consuming. Expectations begin to appear. Emotional dependency begins to appear. Vulnerability becomes unavoidable. And that is usually the exact moment the withdrawal starts, not because they stopped caring, but because closeness itself activated fear inside them. Meanwhile, the empath experiences the exact opposite internal process, where the avoidant associates intimacy with danger, the empath associates intimacy with emotional survival. Connection becomes the place where they regulate their nervous system. Love becomes the place where they seek reassurance, grounding, emotional safety, and identity. And just like the avoidant, this pattern usually started long before adulthood. Many empaths grew up learning that love required emotional sensitivity, reading people carefully, anticipating emotional shifts, becoming emotionally available before others even asked for it. They learned to monitor moods constantly because emotional unpredictability in childhood often forced them into hyper-awareness. Some became caretakers emotionally before they were ever truly cared for themselves. Others learned that being deeply understanding made them valuable to people who could not fully love them consistently. So when an empath meets an avoidant person, something almost frightening happens psychologically. Both nervous systems recognize something familiar. The avoidant feels temporarily safe because the empath is emotionally giving and accepting. The empath feels intensely connected because the avoidant initially opens up in ways that feel deeply intimate. For a brief moment, both people feel like they found exactly what they were missing. But what they actually found was compatibility between two unresolved attachment wounds. That is why these relationships feel so powerful so quickly. It is not always because the connection is uniquely healthy or spiritually destined. Sometimes it is because both people unconsciously trigger patterns their nervous systems already recognize from childhood. Familiarity gets mistaken for destiny all the time in trauma-based relationships. The empath feels emotionally alive because they are trying to earn closeness from someone emotionally inconsistent. The avoidant feels emotionally safe because the empath keeps pursuing even when they withdraw. And without realizing it, both people start reinforcing the exact behaviors keeping the cycle alive. The empath begins overgiving emotionally to restore connection. The avoidant begins withdrawing emotionally to restore internal space. One moves toward anxiety, the other moves toward distance, and each person accidentally validates the other person's fear. The more the empath pursues, the more the avoidant feels overwhelmed. The more the avoidant distances themselves, the more the empath feels abandoned. Neither person feels emotionally safe, but both people become emotionally attached to the dynamic itself. That is why logic alone rarely breaks these cycles, because this is not happening only at the level of conscious thought, it is happening biologically. Your nervous system is constantly tracking emotional safety underneath your awareness. Every delayed response, every subtle shift in affection, every moment of emotional disconnection gets processed, not just psychologically, but physically. That is why people in these relationships often feel exhausted all the time. Their body never fully relaxes. Their nervous system stays activated, waiting for emotional certainty that never fully arrives. And over time, something even more dangerous begins happening. The empath slowly starts confusing emotional intensity with love itself. Calm relationships begin feeling boring. Predictable love feels emotionally flat. Stability feels unfamiliar because their nervous system became conditioned to associate emotional unpredictability with passion and connection. This is why so many people leave toxic attachment cycles only to miss them later. Not because the relationship was healthy, but because the nervous system became addicted to emotional volatility. Intermittent reinforcement is one of the strongest conditioning mechanisms in human psychology. When affection arrives unpredictably, the brain releases even more dopamine chasing the reward because uncertainty intensifies emotional fixation. That is the same mechanism behind gambling addiction, the same mechanism behind compulsive reward-seeking behavior. Your brain becomes obsessed, not because fulfillment is consistent, but because fulfillment is uncertain. And once you understand that, something painful starts becoming clear. You are never only fighting for love. You are fighting against a nervous system that had learned to associate unpredictability with emotional significance. That is why these relationships can feel impossible to let go of, even when they are destroying your peace. Because your conscious mind may know the relationship is unhealthy while your nervous system still believes emotional reunion equals survival. And until that deeper pattern is understood, most people stay trapped trying to solve emotionally what was actually conditioned biologically years before the relationship ever began. At some point, almost every empath trapped in this cycle reaches the same conclusion. If I just love them correctly, they will finally feel safe enough to stay. That belief becomes the emotional engine behind everything. You become more patient, more understanding, more emotionally available. You start reading attachment styles, watching relationship videos late at night, learning how to communicate more gently, more carefully. You convince yourself that if you can just become emotionally safe enough for them, eventually their walls will come down permanently. And for a while, it even seems like it is working. They start opening up more. They become vulnerable again. They tell you things they have never told anyone. They hold you closer, stay longer, look at you in ways that make you feel like you are finally reaching the version of them hidden underneath all the distance. Those moments become everything to you because they feel real, deep, intimate, and they are real. That is what makes this trap so psychologically devastating. The connection is not fake. The feelings are not fake. But the consistency is, and most people do not realize that consistency is what determines whether love becomes emotionally safe or emotionally addictive. You think you are fighting for love, but what you are actually fighting for is emotional predictability. And because you occasionally receive it, your brain keeps believing permanent closeness is just one more breakthrough away. That is the invisible trap. You keep trying to solve inconsistency with more emotional effort. But inconsistency is exactly what keeps the nervous system attached in the first place. The human brain does not become addicted to things that are consistently available nearly as intensely as it becomes addicted to things that arrive unpredictably. That is why casinos work. That is why intermittent reinforcement is one of the most powerful conditioning systems ever studied in behavioral psychology. When rewards come randomly, the brain becomes obsessed with chasing them because uncertainty amplifies dopamine. And without realizing it, that is exactly what begins happening inside these relationships. The affection becomes the reward, the distance becomes the withdrawal, the reunion becomes the emotional high. Then the cycle repeats again and again until your nervous system no longer knows the difference between love and emotional survival. You think you are attached to the person, but often you are attached to the emotional cycle itself. That realization changes everything once you finally see it clearly, because suddenly you understand why calm relationships started feeling less emotionally intense to you. Stability never created the same chemical rush. Predictability never gave your brain the same emotional spike as finally receiving affection after emotional deprivation. Your nervous system became conditioned to chase relief instead of peace. And relief is incredibly deceptive because it feels powerful emotionally. When someone who has been distant suddenly becomes warm again, your entire body lights up. Your chest softens, your anxiety disappears temporarily, your mind stops racing, you feel connected again. But what you are experiencing in that moment is often not secure love. It is the nervous system releasing tension after prolonged emotional uncertainty. That is why people inside these dynamics confuse emotional intensity with soul-level connection. They mistake the emotional crash and relief cycle for depth because the feelings are so overwhelming. But intensity is not proof of compatibility. Sometimes intensity is simply proof that your nervous system has been destabilized long enough that any temporary closeness now feels euphoric. And this is the part that hurts the most once you finally understand it. The more emotionally unavailable someone becomes, the more valuable their affection starts feeling to you psychologically. Not because they are objectively more loving, but because scarcity increases emotional fixation. Your brain starts assigning enormous value to moments of connection because those moments became rare. You begin treating basic emotional consistency like something extraordinary. A simple, affectionate text suddenly feels deeply meaningful. One emotionally vulnerable conversation suddenly feels life-changing. One weekend of closeness suddenly erases months of confusion. That is how people slowly normalize emotional deprivation without realizing it. Their standards shift so gradually they cannot even see it happening. And because empaths naturally look for meaning inside emotional pain, they often romanticize the struggle instead of recognizing the addiction underneath it. They say things like, this connection is just complicated, or real love takes patience, or they are just scared to be hurt. But deep down, their nervous system is trapped inside a biochemical loop, constantly chasing the next emotional reunion. The relationship stops being about mutual emotional safety and starts becoming about emotional access, access to warmth, access to reassurance, access to connection, access to the version of the person who only appears intermittently. And every time that version returns, your brain resets the hope completely. That is why people stay long after their emotional health starts collapsing. Because hope is one of the most neurologically powerful emotional experiences a human being can feel, especially when it arrives unpredictably. You are not just attached to who they are, you are attached to who they occasionally become. And that occasional version of them keeps you emotionally invested enough to tolerate everything else. But eventually, if the cycle continues long enough, something terrifying starts happening internally. You stop trusting your own emotional reality. You stop asking whether the relationship fulfills you emotionally and start asking whether you are simply expecting too much. You begin minimizing your pain because the good moments feel so emotionally significant. You tell yourself no relationship is perfect. You tell yourself they are trying. You tell yourself at least they come back. And that sentence alone reveals how deeply trapped the nervous system has become, because healthy love is not measured by how often someone returns after emotionally disappearing. Healthy love is measured by emotional safety that does not constantly need to be repaired in the first place. But by the time most empaths realize this, they are already exhausted. Their nervous system is depleted. Their self-worth is tied to emotional validation from someone inconsistent. And the most painful part is that they still believe more love will eventually fix the very thing destroying them. That is the trap. Not that you love too deeply, but that you kept confusing emotional craving with emotional connection. The turning point usually does not arrive dramatically. There is no movie scene, no perfect speech, no sudden moment where all the confusion disappears instantly. In fact, for most empaths, the shift begins quietly, almost invisibly. It starts with exhaustion, a deep emotional exhaustion that no amount of reassurance from the other person can fully repair anymore. One day you wake up and realize you cannot keep living inside emotional uncertainty without losing yourself completely. You notice how tired your mind has become. Tired of analyzing messages, tired of waiting for emotional consistency, tired of trying to decode someone who keeps changing between closeness and distance. And for the first time, something inside you starts asking a different question, not how do I make this work, but why am I working this hard just to feel emotionally safe in the first place? That question changes everything, because until that moment, all of your attention was directed outward. You were studying them, understanding them, excusing them, trying to become emotionally perfect for them. But now your awareness begins turning inward. And once that happens, the illusion slowly starts collapsing. You begin noticing things you ignored before. You notice how often your emotional state depended on their behavior. You notice how much anxiety you normalized. You notice how rarely you actually felt calm inside the relationship. You realize that what you call deep love often felt more like emotional survival. And the most painful realization of all starts becoming impossible to ignore. You were abandoning yourself while trying not to lose them. You stopped speaking honestly because you feared emotional distance. You stopped expressing needs because you feared being too much. You tolerated inconsistency because you believed patience would eventually create stability. Slowly, your self-worth became tied to your ability to keep the connection alive. And once you finally see that clearly, something inside you breaks, but not in the way you think. It is not the kind of breaking that destroys you. It is the kind that wakes you up. Because for the first time, you stop romanticizing the pain. You stop calling confusion chemistry. You stop calling emotional inconsistency depth. You stop interpreting your suffering as proof the connection must be meaningful. And suddenly you realize something that changes the entire dynamic forever. The problem was never that you were not enough. The problem was that you kept trying to receive secure love from an emotionally insecure system. No amount of empathy can heal someone into consistency if they are not actively confronting the patterns inside themselves. No amount of patience can create emotional safety with someone who still experiences intimacy as a threat. And no amount of self-sacrifice can build a healthy relationship if your nervous system is constantly being pushed into survival mode. That realization hurts because empaths naturally believe love can transform people. They believe understanding creates healing. They believe emotional presence eventually melts emotional distance, and sometimes it does, but only when both people are equally willing to face themselves, honestly. Otherwise, the empath becomes the only person carrying emotional responsibility for the entire relationship while slowly collapsing under the weight of it. The turning point happens when you finally stop trying to rescue the connection at the expense of yourself. Not because you stopped loving them, but because you started noticing what loving them was costing you mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually. You begin seeing how deeply dysregulated your nervous system has become, how difficult it has become to simply feel calm, how much energy you spend anticipating emotional shifts, how often your mood changes based on tiny signals from another person. And for the first time, instead of asking how to keep them emotionally close, you start asking what it would feel like to finally feel emotionally safe within yourself again. That question becomes the beginning of your freedom. Because the moment your focus shifts from preserving the attachment to preserving your own peace, the entire dynamic starts losing power over you. The same behaviors that once completely destabilized you begin looking different. Their distance no longer feels mysterious. It starts feeling familiar, predictable, cyclical. You stop interpreting every withdrawal as a reflection of your worth. You stop believing every reconnection means permanent change has finally arrived. You begin seeing the pattern instead of getting hypnotized by the moments. And once you see the pattern clearly, it becomes impossible to fully unsee it again. That is the painful beauty of awareness. It destroys illusion permanently. Suddenly you realize you spent months or years chasing emotional clarity from someone who could barely provide it consistently even to themselves. You realize your nervous system was trained to seek emotional validation externally because internally you stopped feeling emotionally grounded without their reassurance. And maybe the most powerful shift of all is this. You stop seeing yourself as the person who was rejected. You start seeing yourself as the person who stayed too long trying to earn consistency from someone incapable of giving it reliably. That changes the emotional energy completely because rejection creates shame, but awareness creates responsibility. And responsibility, while painful, is where real power begins. The empath starts understanding that healing was never about becoming less loving. It was about learning that love without emotional safety eventually becomes self-abandonment. And once that truth fully lands inside you, the relationship starts losing the psychological control it once had over your nervous system. Not instantly, not perfectly, but enough for you to finally begin pulling your emotional energy back towards yourself, instead of constantly pouring it into someone who could only hold intimacy in temporary moments before fear pulled them away again. Real power begins the moment you stop trying to control their behavior and start rebuilding control over your own nervous system instead. That sounds simple when people say it online, but in reality, this is one of the hardest emotional shifts an empath will ever go through. Because for so long, your emotional survival depended on emotional access to them. Their attention regulated you, their affection reassured you, their distance destabilized you. So when you finally begin pulling your energy back, it does not immediately feel empowering. At first, it feels terrifying. It feels unnatural. Your nervous system panics because it mistakes detachment for loss. That is why so many people return to unhealthy dynamics even after they intellectually understand the relationship is hurting them. Awareness alone does not instantly erase emotional conditioning. Your body still remembers the cycle long after your mind recognizes the truth. And this is where most people misunderstand boundaries completely. Boundaries are not punishments. They are not emotional walls designed to force someone to chase you harder. Real boundaries are internal decisions about what your nervous system will no longer tolerate in exchange for temporary connection. A boundary is the moment you stop abandoning yourself to maintain access to someone else. It is the moment you stop negotiating your emotional well-being every time another person becomes inconsistent. And the difficult truth is that boundaries often feel lonely before they feel peaceful. Because when you stop over-pursuing, stop over-explaining, stop anxiously trying to repair every emotional rupture immediately, there is suddenly silence where your survival strategy used to be. You no longer send the extra paragraph. You no longer monitor their energy every hour. You no longer shape your entire emotional state around whether they moved closer or farther away today. And at first, your nervous system interprets that stillness as danger because chaos became familiar. But eventually, if you stay with yourself long enough, something incredible begins happening internally. Your body starts calming down. Your mind stops obsessing constantly. You begin noticing how much mental space was consumed by emotional uncertainty. How much of your identity became organized around managing someone else's inconsistency. And slowly, almost quietly, your emotional center starts returning to you. That is what emotional detachment actually is. Not coldness, not pretending not to care, not becoming emotionally unavailable yourself. Emotional detachment is the ability to stay connected to your own peace regardless of another person's emotional fluctuations. It is caring without collapsing, loving without self-abandonment, remaining emotionally open without making another human being responsible for your entire internal stability. And one of the most powerful things that happens during this phase is that silence begins changing meaning for you completely. Before, silence felt threatening. Every delayed response activated anxiety. Every emotional withdrawal felt like danger. But now silence becomes information instead of panic. You stop rushing to close emotional gaps immediately. You stop interpreting distance as proof you are unworthy. You stop chasing clarity from people whose actions already gave you clarity repeatedly. Instead of desperately pulling people closer every time they withdraw, you begin observing patterns calmly. And observation changes everything because emotional chaos loses power the moment you stop reacting automatically to it. This is also where the empath starts realizing something painful but liberating. You cannot heal another person by sacrificing yourself emotionally. You cannot love someone into emotional readiness if they are still running from intimacy internally. And you definitely cannot build secure love while constantly betraying your own emotional needs to preserve connection. For so long, you believed love meant endurance, patience, understanding, emotional self-sacrifice. But real love, healthy love, secure love does not require you to constantly recover from the relationship itself. That realization starts shifting your standards permanently. You no longer become hypnotized by temporary intensity. You begin valuing consistency more than chemistry, stability more than emotional highs, presence more than potential. And the strange thing is, at first, healthy dynamics might even feel less exciting to your nervous system because your body was conditioned to associate unpredictability with emotional significance. Calm feels unfamiliar after chaos, but unfamiliar does not mean wrong. In fact, for many empaths, peace initially feels emotionally empty, simply because their nervous system became addicted to emotional volatility. That is why healing requires retraining your body to stop confusing anxiety with love. And that process changes the way you move through relationships completely. You stop chasing people who keep disappearing emotionally. You stop trying to earn consistency through overgiving. You stop shrinking yourself to avoid triggering abandonment. And maybe most importantly, you stop needing emotional closure from people incapable of giving it consistently. because eventually you realize closure was never going to come from finally understanding them perfectly. Closure comes from understanding yourself clearly enough to stop participating in cycles that destroy your peace. That is the real shift. The empath stops asking how to keep the connection alive and starts asking whether the connection allows them to stay emotionally alive inside themselves. And once that question becomes more important than the fear of losing someone, the entire dynamic changes permanently. Because now your nervous system is no longer organized around chasing emotional reassurance externally. It is learning how to create emotional safety internally first. That is real power. Not making someone stay, not finally becoming enough for emotionally unavailable people to choose you consistently. Real power is becoming emotionally grounded enough that another person's inconsistency no longer has the ability to control your sense of worth, peace, or identity. One day, almost without realizing it, you stop checking your phone with the same desperation. Their silence no longer feels like an emergency. Their distance no longer immediately collapses your nervous system. The emotional hooks that once controlled your entire inner world begin losing their grip quietly, slowly, almost invisibly. And that shift changes more than the relationship. It changes you, because for the first time in a very long time, your peace is no longer being negotiated every single day. You start sleeping better, thinking more clearly, laughing without waiting for someone else's validation first. The mental fog begins lifting, and suddenly you can see the relationship without the chemical haze of emotional craving distorting everything anymore. And when that happens, another realization starts emerging underneath all the pain. You were never difficult to love. You were emotionally starving inside a connection that trained you to question your own worth constantly. The relationship did not fail because you cared too deeply. It failed because you kept pouring emotional energy into a dynamic that could not consistently hold it safely. That is an important distinction, because for so long you thought your sensitivity was the problem. Your needs, your emotions, your desire for consistency. But healthy love does not punish you for needing emotional safety. Healthy love does not make you feel guilty for wanting clarity. Healthy love does not repeatedly trigger abandonment wounds and then call the emotional damage intimacy. And the strange thing is, once you truly understand that, you stop feeling angry in the same way. Not because what happened no longer hurt, but because you finally see the pattern clearly enough to stop personalizing it completely. You realize their inability to stay emotionally present was never proof you were unlovable. It was proof they were fighting battles inside themselves that love alone could never solve for them. And maybe for the first time, you stop trying to carry those battles for them emotionally. You stop trying to decode every contradiction. You stop trying to rescue the connection from its own instability. You stop needing the relationship to transform into something different in order for you to finally feel okay. That is the real ending most people never talk about. Healing is not always the moment you stop loving someone. Sometimes healing is simply the moment you stop losing yourself while loving them, because there is a huge difference between missing someone and abandoning yourself for them. And eventually your nervous system learns that difference too. The same person who once felt emotionally impossible to let go of slowly becomes emotionally human again. Not magical, not irreplaceable, not the center of your emotional universe, just human. Flawed, wounded, inconsistent, and once the illusion fades, something unexpected happens. You stop craving emotional intensity the same way. Chaos stops looking romantic. Emotional unpredictability stops feeling deep. You begin craving things that once seemed almost boring to your old nervous system. Consistency, calmness, presence, safety, reciprocity. You realize peace was never empty. Your nervous system was simply unfamiliar with it. And that realization changes every relationship you have after this, because now you can feel the difference between someone who creates anxiety and someone who creates stability. You can feel the difference between being chosen consistently and being emotionally revisited intermittently. You can feel the difference between real connection and emotional addiction disguised as passion. And maybe the most powerful part of all this is what happens to your relationship with yourself afterward. You become more protective of your energy, more honest about your needs, less willing to confuse potential with reality. You stop chasing emotionally unavailable people, hoping your love will finally convince them to stay. You stop translating inconsistency into mystery or depth, and slowly your self-respect becomes stronger than your fear of losing people. That is when your entire life changes emotionally. Not because you finally found someone perfect, but because you stopped believing you had to earn love through emotional suffering first. And maybe that is the final truth hiding underneath all of this. The relationship was never just teaching you about them. It was teaching you about the parts of yourself that still believed love had to be unstable in order to feel meaningful. It was revealing every place inside you where abandonment still controlled your decisions. Every place where emotional inconsistency still felt familiar enough to confuse with connection. And once you see that clearly, the cycle can finally end. Not because the other person suddenly changes, but because you do. Because eventually, after all the confusion, all the overthinking, all the waiting, all the emotional exhaustion, you finally understand something your nervous system could not understand before. Love should not constantly feel like recovery from pain. And maybe for the first time in your life, you stop asking whether they will come back. Because maybe the real healing begins the moment you realize you no longer need them to.